Light Tank Mark ETH Light Tank Mark III gets short shrift in most published works on tanks, as it was little more than a production version of the improved Light Tank Mark IB, with the new suspension, Rolls-Royce engine, and Wilson transmission. However, closer inspection shows an enlarged turret, modified hull shape and improved ventilation for the engine, and an alloy sub for reduce weight. However, this was offset by slightly thicker armor, so it was in fact about 5 cwt heavier than the Mark -1. Production was shared between Vickers and Royal Ordnance, with a total of 42 tanks built, some of which reputedly carried the bigger .50 cal Vickers skin instead of the .303 cal. Virtually all of these tanks were shipped to the Middle East around 1935 to increase the strength of the 6th Battalion Royal Tank Corps. This unit was created in Egypt in 1932, unofficially at first, by the amalgamation of 3rd and 5th Armored Car Companies, Royal Tank Corps. To begin with, it was limited to 2 companies of RAF-3rd medium tanks and Carden Lloyd carriers. In the event, it was company that took 18 light tanks Mark III to Palestine in 1936. A few of these tanks were also operated by the Egyptian Army. 1. Light Tank Mark III, Egyptian Army. The Egyptian Army included a light tank unit, which for a while was equipped with redundant British light tanks Mark III. It was extensively photographed for propaganda purposes early in the war, although the truth of the situation was somewhat different. Although it was under the command of senior British officers and reasonably well equipped with British weapons, the Egyptian Army was not comfortably disposed towards the British. It accepted joint responsibility for the defense of Egypt, without going to the lengths of declaring war, but was not entirely trusted by the British and was withdrawn from the front line when threatened. Relations between troops and their own Egyptian officers were not good. The light tank Mark III dated from 1932 and was in essence an improved Mark II. Powered by a Rolls-Royce engine and running on the later pattern Horstman suspension, it was another 2-man tank armed with a single Vickers machine gun and covered by slightly thicker armor. In pre-war years, it was probably the dominant British light tank in the Middle East. It was used by 6th Battalion, Royal Tank Corps, in Palestine in 1936 and later by South African troops in East Africa, although it was not really suitable for a modern conflict. In Egyptian service, the light tanks were painted a light stone color overall, with limited Egyptian markings. 2. Light Tank Mark IV, 102 Officer Cadet Training Unit, Sandhurst, August 1940. The 102nd Officer Cadet Training Unit 102 OCTU was formed from the Westminster Dragoons, whose badge is illustrated in the early part of the war. They did their training on a selection of light tanks, many of which were rather past their prime. This light tank Mark IV is typical, the last of the 2-man light tanks. It dated from 1934 but was destined to be replaced by 3-man light tanks fairly soon. Of an unusual shape which tends to give the impression that it was short in length and tall in height, when in fact it was neither. It still had an alarming habit of pitching forwards on rough ground. The tank commander was therefore provided with 2 hand grips on top of the turret to prevent him from being thrown out. The tank is finished in a popular disruptive camouflage scheme of green and black, but the broad white band on the lower half of the turret was introduced in the United Kingdom towards the end of 1940. The other prominent marking, the white circle and cross, was adopted and applied to vehicles taking the part of the enemy in a military exercise. Notice also the irregular patch of lime green painted on the sloping surface in front of the driver. This was gas-sensitive paint which would change color in the presence of poison gas, prompting the crew to wear their gas masks if it was present. 15. Yet that was not the end of the story of the light tank Mark III. Their true moment of glory was still to come. In June 1940, 12 of these tanks, probably veterans of 6th Royal Tank Regiment, were sent from Egypt to Kenya and handed over to the South Africans, who operated them as No. 1 Light Tank Company. Despite the fact that they had only limited training, the South Africans kept most of these tanks in service for the next 12 months, and they seemed to have made an effective contribution to every battle they took part in. Most of the time they were carried on improvised tank transporters, which South Africans called porties. Although South African military historian Neil Orpen described them as in appearance not unlike Bren gun carriers fitted with turrets, they were certainly better than nothing, and achieved results out of all proportion to their numbers or effectiveness. Yet the Rolls-Royce engine gave evidence of excessive wear when used in a tank, So for the future, it was decided to revert to a Meadows unit. Light tank Mark IV. The appearance of the Mark IV light tank in 1934 introduced a striking change in basic design. A lot of somewhat extravagant claims were made in respect of the new tank, mostly concerned with the construction of the hull, although it is difficult to confirm many of these. Even so, it was an unusual design, and likely to be mistaken for anything else. It was the last of two-man light tanks to be built to War Office requirements, but it is not entirely clear what the designers were aiming for. At first sight it looks inherently unstable, with a tall hull and short track base. However, on closer examination these proved to be illusions. Much was made of the inherent strength of the hull, which in profile looks like a squashed parallelogram, interrupted only by the driver's hatch and the turret perched on top. Maximum armor thickness was 12 mm, and the overall weight was 4.3 tons. Even so, it is the suspension that creates the illusion. It looks shorter than on previous tanks because it lacks the rear idler wheel, which set a pattern for subsequent models. In fact, in terms of track length and contact with the ground, there is not a great deal in it. In respect of overall height, it was lower than Theodor three-man types and only marginally taller than the light tank Mark II. One change that looks like a reversion to earlier days was the return to the Meadows engine, the straight 6-type EST, which developed just under 90 bhp, giving the tank a top speed of 36 miles per hour. This made it the fastest of them all, and speed was going to be a vital factor for the future. The engine was located on the right of the hull with the driver sitting alongside it, while Theodore was situated directly behind him, giving the tank a decidedly lopsided look, and making it very definitely left-hand drive. The Wilson pre-selector transmissions was dropped in favor of a Vickers-Armstrong's 5-speed crash type, and lever-operated clutch and brake steering. One can only imagine that this was a general return to simpler, more rugged systems that did not require so much careful attention and maintenance. Nothing shows more how production of the light tank Mark I squeezed by previous and future models than the way its manufacture was limited to 28 tanks. 14 each from Vickers-Armstrong's and the Royal Ordnance Factory. This meant that the tank was never seen operating at battalion level. On the other hand, they turned up everywhere, rarely in more than 2s and 3s, but always very distinctive on account of their shape. Although the two prototypes were designated as experimental Indian pattern, they never went to India, and instead became prototypes of the light tank Mark IV. A third prototype, lacking any British designation, was delivered to India in 1933, where it was tested by the local authorities. The Indian type can be easily identified by an upward extension of that array, with a series of lookout flaps all around that served as a sort of cupola, something that was characteristic of tanks built for service in India. The armor on the Indian version of the light tank Mark IV was thinner, and the tank was known in India as the light tank Mark I. However, the tank did not appear in very large numbers because, as in Britain, a new model was in the offing. An original ledger gives a total of 29, and the date as March 1934. Light tank Mark IV. The issue that had already risen and been tackled at various levels was the growing awareness that a two-man tank was inadequate, certainly when it came to the role of the tank commander, who was also the gunner and wireless operator, as well as having a host of other, less tangible duties. Two Royal Tank Corps officers tackled the matter in a magazine article with the catching title of the 2.5-man light tank, although more realistically it soon became evident that anything less than a 3-man tank would not be effective. As a result, the next two prototypes L3-1 and L3-2 mounted larger turrets that could accommodate an extra man, and advantage was taken of the additional space to fit a second machine gun. This was a .50 cal Vickers gun, which at that time qualified as an anti-tank weapon. The first prototype was fitted with a full-width turret, squared off at the back and flat on top, with what was known as a bishop's mitre cupola situated offset to the right on top. There is no evidence of a second hatch, and if the commander monopolized the cupola, the gunner still had an auto-do managing the guns. By 1939 the turret had been removed, and the tank became the carrier launcher vehicle for the prototype scissors bridge designed by a Royal Engineer officer and staff from the experimental bridging establishment at Christchurch. The second prototype, L3-2, had a different turret design, sloped at back end with a drum-shaped cupola for the commander on the right. Alongside it on the left was a simple hatch for the third man so he could at least poke his head out and see what was going on. The turret, bigger and heavier than on the two-man tanks, was fitted with a crowded ball race to make it easier to traverse, and was secured by 6 brackets to prevent it from jumping off. The turret also included a rotating portion off-floor, which carried wireless batteries, ammunition containers and a seat for the gunner, attached to a stay, while the commander was provided with a rotating cupola so that he could survey the battlefield. Gear traverse was also available, as it had been for all the earlier light tanks, although one revolution of the handwheel shifted the turret by only 3 degrees. In this form it was clearly similar to the production tank, 22 of which were built, sufficient for 1 mixed tank battalion. Sources vary. Some say that a dozen tanks were first delivered to 1st Tank Brigade, and that technical experts from Vickers Armstrongs accompanied the tanks and worked with the crews to remedy any faults quickly. However, other sources say do not mention this and refer to any tanks, some of which were returned to the manufacturers for improvement while others were shared out between various establishments for trials. There may be some truth in both accounts, but it just goes to show how the facts can get twisted depending upon how they are presented. Another feature seen on some, but not all, production tanks was a pair of armored air intake louvers installed on top of the hinged engine cover plate. These may have been a later addition. In any case, it is clear from photographs that most of these tanks were initially distributed to various newly mechanized cavalry regiments to help with training. So the chances that all 22 ended up with a mixed battalion seem highly unlikely. One light tank Mark V was modified by inserting an extra wheel station and having the drive sprocket moved forward. The idea seems to have been to extend the track base and improve stability in order to make it a better gun platform, but it was never developed. The second prototype, L3E2, had a different turret design, sloped at back end with a drum-shaped cupola for the commander on the right. Alongside it on the left was a simple hatch for the third man so he could at least poke his head out and see what was going on. The turret, bigger and heavier than on the two-man tanks, was fitted with a crowded ball race to make it easier to traverse, and was secured by 6 brackets to prevent it from jumping off. The turret also included a rotating portion off-floor, which carried wireless batteries, ammunition containers and a seat for the gunner, attached to a stay, while the commander was provided with a rotating cupola so that he could survey the battlefield. Gear traverse was also available, as it had been for all the earlier light tanks, although one revolution of the handwheel shifted the turret by only 3 degrees. In this form it was clearly similar to the production tank, 22 of which were built, sufficient for 1 mixed tank battalion. Sources vary. Some say that a dozen tanks were first delivered to 1st Tank Brigade, and that technical experts from Vickers Armstrongs accompanied the tanks and worked with the crews to remedy any faults quickly. However, other sources say do not mention this and refer to any tanks, some of which were returned to the manufacturers for improvement while others were shared out between various establishments for trials. There may be some truth in both accounts, but it just goes to show how the facts can get twisted depending upon how they are presented. Another feature seen on some, but not all, production tanks was a pair of armored air intake louvers installed on top of the hinged engine cover plate. These may have been a later addition. In any case, it is clear from photographs that most of these tanks were initially distributed to various newly mechanized cavalry regiments to help with training. So the chances that all 22 ended up with a mixed battalion seem highly unlikely. One light tank Mark V was modified by inserting an extra wheel station and having the drive sprocket moved forward. The idea seems to have been to extend the track base and improve stability in order to make it a better gun platform, but it was never developed. L3E1. The superintendent of design's tank. As we have seen, the design department at Woolwich Arsenal had been involved with detailed design and manufacture of some light tanks. But the basic features in every version were the responsibility of Vickers Armstrongs, harking right back to the takeover of the Card and Lloyd Company in 1928. It therefore comes as quite a surprise to find the design of a new light tank awarded to the superintendent of design at Woolwich in 1936, and what is more, that it should have been a 3-man machine, which was then something of a novelty. One is forced to ask whether the War Office was giving Royal Ordnance an opportunity, or whether they were hoping to provoke Vickers Armstrongs by presenting them with a rival. Despite many claims made for it in terms of originality and fighting ability, the basic design was little different from Light Tank Mark V. New features included a rear escape door for the crew, an extended rack base, an extra road wheel on each side, and the reintroduction of an adjustable rear idler and armored skirting plates covering the suspension. As a result, the new tank turned out somewhat heavier. Although it served with 1st Tank Brigade in 1937 and was reported unfavorably by the Mechanization Board, it was never developed. Mention should also be made of a series of light tanks built by Vickers Armstrongs with commercial sales in mind. Since, by agreement, Vickers Armstrongs were not permitted to use any features developed by the War Office authorities, these tanks were all slightly different from those issued to the British Army. Outwardly, this seems to have applied only to the shape of the turret, but since matters such as armament and type of radio fitted were left up to the customer, this also resulted in observable differences between tanks of the same type. Most of the countries that were customers for this type of tank were those that had no viable tank industry of their own, and Vickers Armstrongs were competing with French, Italian, and Czechoslovakian builders as well as Marmon Harrington in the United States. Nevertheless, Britain's perceived eminence as the first builder of tanks, along with the supposed expertise in their employment, still counted for a lot. Even so, it has to be said that majority of light tanks supplied by Vickers Armstrongs were no better armed or armored than those used by British forces, and as such could not really be described as tanks capable of going into action against other tanks. The Light Tank Mark V series. It is tempting to see the Light Tank Mark VI as a version of the Light Tank Mark V with a new turret. It is probably more correct to say that they were all part of an evolutionary process. There were no prototypes as such this time, as there was no need, but from the first batch of 41 no less than 10 went to WWII for evaluation, and one of those was a very interesting tank. Tank T-1667 was described as being fitted with a 2PD or anti-tank turret. This was a fairly large turret, open at the top and fitted with a 40mm anti-tank gun. It was tested at MWE and presumably rejected, although on what grounds is not known. It was a pity, on face of it, because the time was coming, and it was not long away, when a light tank fitted with such a weapon would be very useful indeed. The 13 tanks sent to MWE, and indeed the remaining 21 tanks in the batch, all appear to have been perfectly normal. They had the same hull and suspension as the Light Tank Mark V, albeit with maximum armor thickness increased to 14mm, and with the return rollers attached to the foremost bogie. This arrangement seems to have been regarded as being responsible for an epidemic of track shedding, which was cured in later versions. The same Meadows engine and transmission and same cooling arrangements were also employed. However, the spacing of suspension units was altered slightly to give a better ride across country. That array was different. Inside it was provided with a fully rotating floor that carried the gunner and commander on with it, and externally it was extended and squared off at the back. Not unlike the turret of All-3-1 in this respect, in order to provide room for an N07 wireless set. This gave rise to what might have been an awkward situation, which had first surfaced in the case of the Light Tank Mark V. The Royal Tank Corps wanted to introduce the position of gunner-operator, which had not existed before. They desired that gunner should also be the wireless operator, rather than the commander, and it was necessary to negotiate with the trade unions before this could be permitted. These tanks were also seen with 2 4-inch smoke grenade dischargers, one fitted on either side of the turret, but since these were also found on the Light Tank Mark V tanks, they may have been a later fitting. The overall weight had increased to around 5 tons, but this had little effect upon the performance. 3 more batches of the Light Tank Mark VI followed for small numbers of tanks, 2 from Vickers Armstrongs, but the 3rd from then British Locomotive Company, a large private company based in Glasgow. This was part of government policy to expand tank production into the private sector with war imminent, so that other engineering concerns would gain experience of tank production. Individual tanks were sent to the Western Desert for evaluation under extreme conditions, and one, fully equipped with sand shields, was even photographed at Su Oasis, deep in the Egyptian desert, which has legendary associations to the Oracle of Ammon. The next batch of tanks were classified Mark V, and were built in 3 batches amounting to 110 tanks in all, with 1 contract being awarded to the Royal Ordnance Factory. 3 went to MWE for evaluation while 10 were sold to Australia. Distinctive features of the light tank Mark II were that the return roller was now removed from the front bogie on each side and attached directly to the hull, and the commander's cupola was made more angular, becoming essentially octagonal in shape, with glazed lookout ports at the front. An improved version of the Meadows 6-cylinder engine, Type ESTB, was also fitted, although rated at the same horsepower. The next batch, the Mark VIB, was produced in substantial numbers and may be taken as the definitive version of the tank, though not the final one. In terms of appearance, it retained the return roller on the hull side, was fitted with a drum-shaped cupola like the Mark VI, but this time with lookout windows, and had only one armored louver, the upper one, on the engine cover at the front. In other respects it was the same as the preceding models. Nearly 1,000 of these tanks were produced by a range of firms including Tank Mark V, 9th Queen's Royal Lancers. The light tank Mark V was the first three-man light tank to see service with the British Army, appearing in 1934. Production was limited since it was overshadowed by the improved light tank Mark VI. It was powered by a 6-cylinder Meadows engine and armed with a pair of Vickers machine guns, one of .303 cal alongside a heavier weapon of .50 cal, which at the time was regarded as an effective anti-tank weapon for use against lighter vehicles. In practice, as it turned out, this gun was not even good enough to penetrate the armor of an enemy light tank. The 9th Lancers mechanized shortly before the war, in 1937, disposing of most of their horse and adopting armored vehicles instead. For the younger soldiers this was no hardship at all since they tended to find horses tiresome, but to the older soldiers, particularly the officers, it was a considerable wrench since it required the rapid adoption of new skills. In fact, most cavalry regiments went first into armored cars, although the 9th Lancers seemed to have specialized in tracked vehicles and field-tested many interesting prototypes. In typical cavalry fashion, their vehicles were maintained to a very high standard, finished in gloss paint, which was quite suitable for war, with regimental insignia emblazoned on both sides of the turret. All armored regiments were incorporated into the Royal Armored Corps in 1939. 2. Light tank Mark VI, 2PDR tank destroyer. Good as it was mechanically, and available in vast numbers, the light tank Mark VI had one serious failing. It was not provided with an armament powerful enough to disable, let alone destroy an enemy tank, not even an enemy light tank, its own contemporary. Thus, when it appeared in prototype form in 1935, the special version of the light Mark VI, fitted with a 2PDR 40mm anti-tank gun and an open-top turret, was seen as a very useful piece of equipment. It went to WWII in about 1938 and was extensively field-tested by the 9th Royal Lancers, but no production orders followed. It remained a unique piece of equipment. Judged by appearances, since photographs are all we have to go on, the design seems to be quite well balanced. The turret mounting the 2PDR gun was undoubtedly heavier than the normal machine gun turret fitted to the tank, despite being open at the top, but it should have been possible to strengthen the rearmost suspension unit if required. As it was, the design was rejected, possibly because it did not accord with British ideas on armored reconnaissance at the time. It must be said that enemy light tanks were no better off in this respect, although they were somewhat better armored. Even so, it remains a most interesting and potentially useful prototype which could have proven very effective in the not-too-distant future. The Vulcan Foundry, John Fowler & Co. of Leeds, Reston and Hornsby, Armstrong Whitworth, North British Loco and Vickers Armstrongs. In addition to 7 supplied to Canada, some were supplied to Egypt and Turkey and 1 to Iraq. The Indian pattern light tank Mark VIB, a special version of the light tank Mark VI, was prepared for service in India. A contemporary ledger gives the total delivered as 93 with the date as the 24th of August 1936, which ties in closely with general production of the type but clashes with another claim quoted below. The tanks appear to have been identical to the British model except for the fact that on the Indian pattern no cupola was fitted to federate. It is not entirely clear why this was so, as hitherto a cupola was considered essential for light tanks in India, but now for the first time this fixture was no longer considered necessary, and instead the commander was provided with a periscope in his hatch. To begin with, these tanks were issued to British light tank companies in India, Royal Tank Corps formations that had grown out of earlier armored car companies. But when these were disbanded just before World War II, the tanks were passed on to newly mechanized regiments of the Indian Cavalry and to British Cavalry regiments such as the 3rd Carabiniers and the 14th 20th Hussars that were Even so, there were never sufficient light tanks to go around. Indian pattern light tanks accompanied a Royal Armoured Corps regiment of Persia early in the war. They were used briefly against Japanese forces in Hong Kong, and a few seem to have turned up in the Western Desert. Where these latter came from is difficult to determine. According to a history of Vickers Ltd. by G.D. Scott, published in 1962 and 1938, Ellsworth completed theatre for light tanks Mark VIB for India. So it seems the chances of any remaining in Britain were slim. Even so, one source suggests that some light tanks Mark VIB built in Britain, the final batch as it were, had the same modification, the removal of the cupola and its replacement by a second flush hatch. If that is true, then such tanks, seen in the desert, might easily be mistaken for the Indian version. However, the history of the 14th and 20th Hussars by Lieutenant Colonel L.B. Oates, published in 1973, states that any tanks in India that were in good condition were liable to be called in and shipped off to the Middle East. It is also important to point out that when the 14th and 20th Hussars went to Iraq and Lateran in 1941, they were equipped with a mixture of Indian pattern Mark VIB light tanks and carriers with which they fought a number of successful actions. Shortly before the war, the British Army decided to replace the water-cooled Vickers machine guns in armored vehicles with air-cooled Czech-designed Besa machine guns. Naturally, this was easier to achieve on some tanks than on others, and in the case of the light tank Mark VI it was relatively illustrative. The scheme was to replace the .303 cal Vickers with a 7.9 ton Besa and the .50 cal Vickers by a long-barreled 15mm weapon. This new mark of light tank, the Mark VIC, also had a turret fitted without the commander's cupola. In that respect it was like the Indian pattern tanks and featured a periscope in one half of the commander's turret hatch, which replaced the cupola. The fact that the conversion was relatively simple seems to be indicated by an order placed with the Vulcan Foundry in November 1937 for Mark VIBs, the last 40 of which were completed as Mark-1. Mark VIB tanks from this batch could well have been built without cupolas, although at present we have no proof of this. At least one light tank Mark VI was tested on Mitchett Lake near Aldershot, equipped with a pair of floats designed by the Hungarian engineer Nicholas Straussler. Known as Series 2 floats, they were substantial pontoons attached to the sides of the tank to keep it buoyant in the water. However, since the tank relied on the action of its tracks to propel it, progress would have been dreadfully slow. The plan was to issue these floats to divisional cavalry regiments on the scale of 6 pairs per regiment. Some 120 pairs were light tank Mark VIB. The light Mark-1 was the definitive version of the old light Mark VI series. It was a 3-man light tank, weighing a little over 5 tons, armed with a pair of machine guns in a dual mounting, a Vickers water-cooled .303 cal on the left with, alongside it on the right, the larger .50 cal weapon. The driver sat low down on the left with the engine, a Meadow 6-cylinder petrol unit, on his right, separated by a thin steel bulkhead. Most of the driver's controls were as normal: clutch, brake and accelerator pedals, and a 5-speed and reverse gear lever to his right. At the front, between his knees, wherewith to steering sticks. The radiator was situated above the engine, beneath an armored cover but drawing air through a heavily protected ventilation louvre. The Horseman's suspension gave a comfortable ride, although it tended to be rather bouncy across country, making it impossible to fire at all effectively on the move. Normally the tank had to stop in order to aim and fire accurately. Two men occupied the turret, the commander on the right, and his gunner to his left. The turret itself had manual gear traverse, elevation and depression, within limits, was controlled manually, and a tray was provided outside the turret at the front to catch discarded shell cases. A number 9 wireless set was installed on a shelf in the back of the turret, and a rotating floor was provided that went around with the turret, carrying the crew with it. Smoke projector dischargers were fitted, one on each side outside the turret, and there was a spotlight ahead of the cupola on the front of the turret. Made in all, but there is no evidence that they were ever used beyond this one time. The trouble was that the floats were quite bulky, so would have to be transported in a lorry and attached to a tank near to the water's edge, which was an unnecessary complication. From about the middle of 1940 onwards, up to 100 light tank Mark VIs were remanufactured by the MG Car Company Works at Abingdon in Oxfordshire. This seems to have involved stripping them down and fitting new parts where necessary. The firm undertook similar work on Matilda infantry tanks. However, a claim that light tanks were all survivors of the 1st Armored Division expedition to France cannot correct, since we know that only 6 of these tanks ever returned to Britain. One of the most interesting and so far unexplained modifications sampled to light tanks Mark VIB and VI concern the tracks. These appear to have been changed to a double-link pattern, rather likely a scaled-down version of the tracks fitted to a 13 cruiser tanks. They appear to have been a bit wider than the original single-link tracks and required new, twin-ring sprockets, which are very distinctive. There is no reason to suppose that this was connected in any way with the work done by MG cars and may even date from a while earlier. It is also difficult to see what difference it made to the tanks, apart from adding to the weight, and it was definitely not applied to all of them. The project seems to have ended, as it had begun, with little explanation or fanfare. The idea that specialist anti-aircraft tanks would be required seems to have stemmed from experience in France, where the German Stuka dive bomber first revealed itself to be a terrifying, if not actually very effective, weapon. This prompted Major General Vivian Pope, the Royal Armoured Corps representative to the British Expeditionary Force, to advocate the conversion of light tanks to an anti-aircraft role. One tank, usually identified as a light tank Mark V but bearing all the hallmarks of a light tank Mark -1, was converted at Lulworth Camp in Dorset to mount twin 15mm Besa machine guns in place of the turret. But mainstream production began with the conversion of a number of light tanks Mark V into light A tanks Mark I, which involved raising the superstructure and fitting a shallow turret armed with for Besa 7.92mm machine guns. This was followed by a Mark II version of the light tank Mark VIB, which had a taller turret with the same armament but improved sighting arrangements. A total of 68 tanks of both marks were produced and issued to headquarters squadrons of armored regiments in Britain and the Middle East on the scale of for each. Whether they ever shot down an aeroplane is not so clear. The history of one of the newly created Royal Armoured Corps regiments, the 23rd Hussars, contains the following telling phrase: "We also received our first anti-aircraft light tank WWII, which was not a popular vehicle." This appears to have been towards the end of 1941. The establishment of a light tank regiment early in the war is typified by the 4th Queen's Own Hussars in Egypt in 1940. They were equipped with 52 tanks and a dozen Daimler Dingo scout cars. Of these, 4 light tanks were operated by regimental headquarters while the 3 squadrons had 16 tanks each. In each squadron 4 tanks operated with squadron headquarters and 3 were issued to each of the 4 troops. The squadron also had 2 Dingo scout cars and 2 motorcycles, the remaining 6 Dingos being with regimental headquarters. When operating with a mixed formation that included Royal Artillery, at least 1 light tank was dedicated as an observation post vehicle with a regimental driver and 2 Royal Artillery personnel in T turret. Mixed in with the fighting tanks, it was almost impossible to identify, and enabled the gunners to call down fire on any suitable target. Incidentally, the 4th Hussars, who brought all their tanks out from England to Egypt, where they were unloaded at Port Said, say that before they could use them all tanks had to be fitted with, among other things, sand filters, sun compasses, sand shields and an extra leaf to the springs of each tank. They are the only regiment to mention this. Wartime activities in the Western Desert are recorded later. The dismal performance of these light tanks and their obvious unsuitability for modern warfare may have had an unfortunate effect upon the career of the next light tank to be produced by Vickers Armstrongs. The light tank Mark VII, or Tetrarch, never managed to establish itself in that role and, although perceived as a light cruiser tank on account of its armament, is really only famous for one event in World War II. On the evening of D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, 8 Tetrarch light tanks of 6th Airborne Reconnaissance Regiment were landed by glider astride the Orne River, but only reinforced the point that a light tank has no place on a modern battlefield. 1. Light Tank Mark VII, 2nd Light Tank Company, Australian Tank Corps, Melbourne, Australia took delivery of 10 light tanks Mark VII from Britain in 1937. They were a batch built initially for the British Army, so there were no concessions in the design for the hotter climate. 5 each were allocated to the 1st Light Tank Company in New South Wales and to 2nd Light Tank Company in Victoria. since these, along with for old and obsolete medium tanks, represented all the tanks in Australia at the time. They were almost worked into the ground when Australia immobilized in 1939. Even so, they were never used in action. Australian armoured regiments were suited with tanks, such as were available, when they went abroad. The distinguishing features of the Mark VI are the shape of the cupola and the double seat-off armoured ventilation louvres on the sloping engine cover at the front. This view is taken from a photograph of these tanks on parade in Melbourne. Notice how, when the driver has opened up the front panels and his visor, the upper section almost masks the two machine guns in theatre. This is not as bad as it seems, since in action, when the guns are needed, these panels will be closed down. On each side of the turret there are metal brackets with slots in. These would normally support the smoke projector dischargers, although these were not fitted when photograph was taken to Light Tank Mark VI, Canadian Armoured Corps, Borden, Ontario. Canada acquired 14 light tanks Mark VI in 1939. They are said to be from an ordre originale proposed by Australia but subsequently cancelled. Again, like the Australian tanks, they seem to have performed adequately in extremes of climate, although in this case deep snow tended to clog up the running gear and the tracks. The Canadians established their centre of operations at Camp Borden, Ontario, at the time, commanded by the formidable Colonel F. Worthington. The Canadian light tanks were identical to their British counterparts, with the same Etos engine and Vickers machine gun armament. Indeed, they even employed the same pattern of camouflage, only distinguished by their own rather limited style of markings. The tanks were not equipped with heaters of any kind, but the crew were so squashed inside and so close to Fiji that it probably did not matter much. Wearing bulky clothing kept the cold at bay. The expansion of the Canadian Armoured Forces was slow to get underway, but even so the shortage of tanks to train on was a severe hindrance. An influx of the American-built version of the Renault of 1917 helped, as did later tanks of indigenous Canadian construction, and this enabled Canada to field a substantial tank army later in the war. On active service at Battle of France, among the first units of the Royal Armoured Corps to arrive in France were 7 light armoured reconnaissance regiments, each of which on full establishment should have been equipped with 28 light tanks Mark VI and 40 for scout carriers. They may have looked impressive to the British public, watching newsreels back home, but in reality they were almost completely useless, especially in view of what they were going to face in a few months' time. They were, in effect, the modern mechanized equivalent of the mounted divisional cavalry of earlier times, quite adequate for dealing with and armored troops, but totally unsuitable for coping with enemy tanks. Initially the armored vehicles were shipped out and landed at Brest or Saint-Nazaire in the west. Later it was found possible to go by the short sea route from Southampton. The story of all regiments is more or less the same, due to the nature of their equipment. The 1519th Hussars explained that they had 2 sets of tracks for their tanks, battle tracks, which were relatively new, and training tracks, which were nearly worn out but used where possible, to save wear and tear on the battle tracks. The position may be summed up in an account in the history of the 5th Royal Enniskilling Dragoon Guards. A squadron advanced to give battle, but their so-called armor-piercing machine guns had little effect on the German tanks, and they were forced to give ground, losing several vehicles and crews. It was becoming more obvious than ever how hopelessly inadequate were our fighting vehicles in the face of the opposition which now confronted us, German panzers. The Mark V was not only thinly armored, but its suspension was so bad that across country it did not even have the advantage of speed. In this mobile armored warfare the unfortunate Bren carrier troops were in an even worse position. Equipped as they were to do no more than hold ground against infantry and light vehicles, very light vehicles at that. In the whole regiment we could muster no weapon which could be sure of penetrating a German panzer, and had to rely, in the situation now facing us, on bluff and quick thinking. Their part in the adventure ended at Dunkirk at the end of May and early June 1940. It should also be mentioned that members of Brigade Headquarters, 2nd Light Reconnaissance Brigade, formed a unit known as Cook's Light Tanks, using tanks drawn from an ordnance depot, as part of the Special Defensive Force created to protect British General Headquarters at Arras. The only exception to this part of the story was 1st Lothian and Border Yeomanry, which was attached to 51st Highland Division. The division had been stationed further south, ahead of the Maginot Line with the French. As the Germanotic developed, the division was withdrawn and, since there was no point in attempting to rejoin the original BF, they were moved west to join British 1st Armored Division west of the River Somme. By this time the German advance had really got into its stride, which the cruiser tanks of 1st Armored Division were unable to halt. That being so, there was no hope at all that the light tanks of the Lothians would have any effect, and they were rapidly decimated, while the survivors fell back to St. Valery and ultimately Le Havre. Meanwhile, the two regiments of 1st Army Tank Brigade, 4th and 7th Royal Tank Regiments, equipped mostly with Matilda infantry tanks, also operated about a dozen light tanks Mark V between them, which were used as headquarters and liaison vehicles. 2nd Lieutenant Peter Vaux of 4th RTR has an amusing and telling story to tell of his experience during Battle of Arras on the 21st of May 1940-32. I remember a silly thing that happened as we went back along that road. Some small anti-tank gun fired on my light tank and a shot went in through the left of my turret, just behind my gunner's head, and out through the right side off turret just behind my head. I suppose we both turned a bit pale. Then, without a word, the gunner bent down, brought out his small pack, opened it and took out a very smelly pair of socks. He handed one to me, the other has stuffed into the hole on his side and I stuffed mine into the hole on my side. Somehow or other we felt much safer like that. British 1st Armoured Division was landed in western France on 20 to 23 May 1940. It was supposed to move east and link up with the rest of the British Expeditionary Force across the River Somme, and was intended to consist of 6 tank regiments, mostly of cruiser tanks but with approximately 22 light tanks each. However, in the event only the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment got across the Somme. It was sent independently to Calais, where it was ultimately all but destroyed. However, shortly after arrival it did manage to send a light tank patrol to Saint-Omer, which, finding nothing there, returned to Calais. A few light tanks also took part in a breakout to Gravelines, although the majority seemed to have been disabled protecting the port. Meanwhile, further west, the remaining 5 armored regiments of 1st Armored Division advanced to the Somme only to find the Germans in possession and the area heavily defended. They were later joined by 1st Lothian and Border Yeomanry, one of the light armored reconnaissance regiment then attached to 51st Highland Division, which fought until it was wiped out on the retreat to St. Valery. Surviving histories of the division concentrate upon the activities of the cruiser tanks and the final event, and which one, Light Tank Mark Vic, HQ 2nd Armored Brigade 1st Armored Division, France 1940. The Light Tank Mark Vic was certainly the most distinctive of the tanks in the Light Mark 6 series. This was due primarily to a change in armament which had been decided on shortly before Thur. In essence, it meant that Bessa air-cooled machine guns should replace Vickers water-cooled weapons on all armored vehicles, the 7.92 mm in place of the .303 cal and the 15 mm instead of .50 cal. The 15 mm, being that much longer than the .50 cal Vickers, was very distinctive. In practice, the whiplash action of the 15 mm limited it to firing single shots. The Mark Vic could also be identified by the lack of a cupola on top of the turret, flush hatches being provided instead. In theory, it was agreed that regiments of British 1st Armoured Division should be equipped with new Mark Vic tanks while those of the divisional cavalry regiments should use the more common Mark Vib. In practice, it did not work out like that. There were simply not enough Mark Vics to go around, so it seems that in the main those regiments of 2nd Armoured Brigade the Bays, 9th Lancers and 10th Hussars were the only ones to be equipped with this new type of tank. 2 light anti-aircraft tank Mark amounting for 7.92 mm Bessa machine guns in a small turret. The light anti-aircraft tank was the first response to the German dive bomber attacks that were experienced in France in 1940. In practice, the relatively short range of the weapons and the difficulties of observing and tracking a fast-moving aircraft from a tank meant that it was almost impossible to shoot one down. There was only a limited amount of room in the turret, even without a tank commander, so a better designed Mark II version soon appeared, although it was not much of an improvement. Normal practice, when they were available, was to include 4A tanks with regimental headquarters in an armored regiment, but the vehicles themselves were never popular and when tests of the A armament, which involved tracking a jeep with a cannon on the roof, proved too difficult. The entire scheme of basing A vehicles on obsolete light tanks was abandoned. Light tanks are recorded as participating in the long-distance cross-country rugby, the surviving elements of 3rd Armored Brigade. They are TR Brigade, under Brigadier J.T. Crocker. A dozen light tanks, out of 14 that started, made it all the way to Cherbourg just ahead of the Germans. According to one source, the light tanks attached to 1st Armored Division were of the light tank Mark V model, whereas those with 1st Army Tank Brigade and the Divisional Cavalry regiments were Mark WWII. This would make sense, because many off-cruiser tanks with 1st Armored Division were also armed with Besa guns, but it cannot be confirmed entirely, and some may have been Mark WWIIs. One other event of a warlike nature from around this time concerns the 3rd King's Own Hussars. On the 6th of May 1940, 17 men from this regiment with 3 light tanks were shipped to Norway from Leith on the Polish liner Chobry. They were originally destined for Harstad, but the Chobry was diverted from there on the 14th, after landing most of its troops, and sent south towards Namsos with the men and tanks of the 3rd Hussars on board, along with 1 battalion of Irish Guards. The ship was bombed relentlessly by the Germans and set on fire. The men were taken off by the Royal Navy escort, which then had to sink the blazing Chobry, which went to the bottom with the 3 tanks. Captain Tyrrell, the officer commanding the 3rd Hussars detachment, wrote what their story would have been had their tanks landed in a country where the only roads were precipitous goat tracks can only be conjectured. A few light tanks, reportedly 6, had their suspensions modified to provide a steadier gun platform. This was done by fitting to double bogies on each side, facing back to back, with a separate idler wheel and to return rollers on each side, and extra shock absorbers fitted to the suspension units. One at least was converted from a Mark -1, while others are said to have been based on the VIB. In the case of the Mark -1, the turret was like an Indian pattern, without a raised cupola but with a nearly flush hatch instead. Whether this was true of all the tanks so modified is not at all clear. It is said that this gave the tanks a much steadier gun platform, but, as they found in France, the armament on these tanks was regarded as almost useless, so there was no point in the conversion. Some of these tanks are believed to have accompanied the 1st Armored Division to France in 1940. Any attempt to catalogue all the armored regiments and other units in Great Britain that had light tank Mark V's in the immediate post-Dunkirk period is almost certainly doomed to failure, and would probably include all of them, since the light tank Mark VI was by far the most common type of tank available. All we can hope to do is to concentrate on a few of the more interesting units and make some general points. For instance, before it wasn't across to France in May 1940, the 1st Armored Division, or at least that were brigades that would form it, were distinctly different, although seen as being complementary. In the original plan, 2nd Armored Brigade, composed of 3 cavalry regiments, was designated as a light brigade to be equipped exclusively with light tanks, while 3rd Armored Brigade, formed with 3 regiments, was to be equipped with cruiser tanks. In the event, before they left for France, the decision was taken to mix them up and create 6 regiments, each with a portion of cruiser tanks and the balance made up from light tanks, which were deemed to be ideal for reconnaissance, command and liaison duties. This was particularly hard on the cavalry regiments, whose men needed to learn the intricacies of the cruiser tanks very quickly to ensure that every regiment in the division had some tanks capable of fighting other tanks. The British abandoned huge numbers of light tanks when they pulled out of France, along with many others. At first glance, the light tanks would not appear to be a lot of use. The German models were better, and even they were regarded as something of a liability following combat experience in France. However, even the British light tanks had a workable and reliable chassis. 36, so a German officer stationed in France, Alfred Becker, initiated a comprehensive rework program for local use. He came up with quite an effective AFV design with a built-up, open-topped superstructure mounting a French 105mm gun that could be operated by a crew of 4. It went into such details as a pivoting earth anchor at the rear to provide stability when firing. There was even a command version with an enclosed superstructure and by a small cupola. Classified as PZKPFW Mark 6E MIT 105mm FH-16, it proved that although almost useless as a fighting tank, the light tank Mark 6 could form the basis of a serviceable self-propelled gun, something the British might have been able to work out for themselves. Even so, the German conversions probably did not last very long and seem to have remained in France on internal security duties. After the fall of France, when the 1st Armored Division was back in the United Kingdom, one of its armored brigades, composed of just 2 regiments, could muster only 81 cruisers and 100 light tanks, although they Light Tank Mark VIB, Navigator's Tank, 8th Hussars, Western Desertone of the more colorful tanks in the Western Desert. This regimental navigator's tank displays an array of colored pennants on the wireless aerial. The colors changed from day to day. Some units preferred this method of identification to the alternative of either a blue flag or a long black cone, believing it to be less obvious to the enemy. The officer responsible for navigation was a key figure in the desert, it being so easy to get lost. He relied on a sun compass, on a bracket to the right of the cupola, to steer at an erring course over the featureless landscape. It was a more certain system than relying on the skills of numerous individuals. Notice also that the rear part of the smoke discharger on the turret side is wrapped in cloth to protect the mechanism from sand. This is because this component was taken from the breech section of a bolt-action rifle. Otherwise, the tank is a typical Mark VIB, although many light tanks had additional stowage at the left side and on the rear hull. In 1941, the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars, to use its full title, was the 2nd Senior Regiment in 7th Armoured Brigade, itself at that time part of 7th Armoured Division, but it depends whether it was the senior brigade in the division or not. When it was the regimental arm of service, the marking would be 25 in white on a red square, but if not, it would be 29 on a green square. To avoid confusion, the tank in our illustration carries no arm of service identification on the back at all. 38 were better off than the newly formed 2nd Armored Division, which could manage only 178 light tanks, instead of the mixture of cruisers and light tanks it should have had on paper. This was probably typical for all regiments, those already formed and those newly forming, but it wasn't avoidable at the time and probably did not last very long after more suitable tanks became available. On the other hand, Royal Armoured Corps training regiments seem to have retained some light tanks Mark -1 until 1942. The 51st Training Regiment based at Catterick certainly did, and probably the 56th at Bovington too. One retired officer, an NCO at that time, tells of how in the event of invasion he was expected to collect a light tank Mark VI from the driving and maintenance school, take it to the armory to be armed, and then to the wireless wing to collect a wireless set, before sallying forth to deal. However, if we can base our information on photographic evidence, then one of the biggest users of light tanks, even including some Mark IV tanks as well as Mark VIBs, was 102 Officer Cadet Training Unit, then a function of Westminster Dragoons, which undertook extensive training in Sandhurst, Blackbush area of Surrey. Incidentally, some 50 light tanks, part of a commercial order by Vickers Armstrongs for the Dutch Army, were still in Britain at the outbreak of war and were appropriated for the British Army. Designated officially as Markieb, but known to all and sundry as Dutchmen, they were allocated for training. However, some of them, on the special instructions of the Prime Minister, were passed on for use by the Greek army. All those that survived eventually ended up in second-line service with the German army. The Mediterranean theater listing the regiments that operated the light tank Mark VI is almost pointless, and probably impossible. They include the tank battalions of Army Tank Brigades, which had a handful attached to battalion and squadron headquarters of certain regiments, such as the 3rd Hussars, the 4th Hussars and, initially at least, the 7th Hussars, which were equipped exclusively with light tanks. The majority of RAC regiments, at least in the first 2 years of Desert War, seem to have been organized on a more generous basis as far as light tanks are concerned. Proportions up to about 50-50 appear to have been common, and that would apply to most of the regiments serving in that theater at the time. The 1st Light Battalion, Royal Tank Corps, was sent out to Egypt in October 1935 to add its strength to the tank forces already out there, limited as they were, during the Abyssinian crisis. They were equipped at the time with light tanks Mark VI and remained out there until October 1936, to the detriment of tank brigade training in Britain for that year. The battalion returned to Egypt in 1938. Now equipped with light tanks Mark VI complete to its establishment total of 52 tanks. It formed part of what was originally known as the Mobile Division Egypt but later became a famous 7th Armored Division. It was formed under the command of Lieutenant Colonel P.C.S. Hobart, but was initially woefully short of tanks. Among the regiments already out there was the 7th Hussars. It had a selection of light tanks Mark III, Mark VI and Mark VII, but only sufficient to equip 2 squadrons, even then no heavy opening .50 cal machine gun. Ammunition was available for the light tanks Mark VI, so they could only use their .303 cal machine guns. The 7th Hussars was converted from horse cavalry to a fully mechanized regiment after it arrived in Egypt, shortly before the war. It was issued with a mixture of light tanks, mostly of the light tank Mark VI variety. Its men make the point that the life of a tank in the Middle East was measured largely by the longevity of its tracks, and that since the tracks on most light tanks were very nearly worn out, they did not expect much of them. Once they had settled in and got used to their tanks, they repeatedly heard rumors that heavier cruiser tanks would be arriving from Britain to replace them. But these remained only rumors for some time. When at last some did turn up, many without guns, the 7th Hussars received only enough to equip a squadron to begin with. The other 2 squadrons went to war in their light tanks. It has been said that when these light tanks were designed and first issued, the general belief in the British Army was that tanks were unlikely to fight other tanks, so machine guns and thin armor were considered perfectly acceptable. This assertion needs to be treated with care. Even back in the days of the old medium tanks, firing on the move was standard practice, and when the 2PDR gun was introduced in 1936 it was almost exclusively for firing against other tanks. Of course, when the light tanks were first introduced they were seen as glorified armored cars, and often used against forces that were not armed with tanks or vehicles of any sort at all. And of course, when the 3-man light tank was introduced, from about 1935, its armament was improved by the addition of a .50 cal heavy machine gun, because it was regarded in those days as a weapon capable of dealing with other light tanks and armored cars. For one, the 7th Hussars took part in most of the early actions in the Western Desert, from the successful attack on Fort Capuzzo on the 14th of June 1940, to the assault on Tobruk in January 1941. In the former action they borrowed 2 light tanks Mark VII, one each from 1st and 6th Royal Tank Regiments. The reason being that these tanks were fitted with powerful spotlights that were considered vital for use at night. They were also in the van on the difficult cross-country journey to Beta Fam. The going was particularly intense, with areas of slab rock and large boulders that reduced speed and increased petrol consumption to an alarming rate, not to mention the difficulty of negotiating areas strewn with thermos bombs, which could damage tracks and suspension, albeit without harming the crew. The regiment arrived at Beta Fam on the 5th of February and at once went on to the attack, capturing and destroying a number of Italian lorries. Meanwhile, the 8th Hussars was making do, operating as a light regiment equipped with American Ford V8 pickup trucks, each armed with a single Vickers Berthier light machine gun. The 8th Hussars, more fully the King's Royal Irish Hussars, started to receive light tanks early in 1939, or what they describe as cast-offs from the 7th Hussars and the 6th Royal Tank Regiment. These included 7 Mark VIBs and 11 Mark IIIs, which were of course 2-man light tanks armed with a single .303 cal machine gun, but by the end of April they had enough Mark VI light tanks to equip A and squadrons, while C Squadron had to make do with the Mark III. Later still, however, C Squadron was rewarded with 2 troops of light tank Mark V and 2 troops of the new A9 cruiser tanks. However, just to prove that not all of the actions initiated by the British Army against the Italians were successful, it is necessary to recount a few details of the raid mounted by the 8th Hussars against the Italian camp at Mactila in October 1940. Mactila was the most northerly of a series of camps established by the Italians as part of their invasion of Egypt in the latter summer of 1940. Indeed, Mactila was so far north it was virtually on coast, and was occupied by the 1st Libyan Division of the Italian Army. The attack on Mactila was mounted at night, on the 23rd of October 1940, by the 8th Hussars and 2nd Battalion the Cameron Highlanders. Making a stealthy approach to the Camerons leading on foot backed up by the light tanks 42 of the 8th Hussars, which dared not come into close for fear of suspected boot unidentified minefields. The British were met by withering fire from every weapon the Italians could muster. The British attack had been anticipated, and the tanks and infantry had to withdraw. As dawn broke, the 8th Hussars also came under attack from an armored column of about 20 vehicles. They emerged from the Italian camp at Tummeries, further south, and were unable to fight back since their tanks were cluttered up with Scottish infantry. They were obliged to withdraw, thankfully with no casualties. The 3rd Hussars arrived in Egypt in September 1940, having come directly from Britain complete with their light tanks. Shortly after they landed, the regiment exchanged their B squadron with the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment. Saw that the 3rd Hussars had at least one squadron of cruiser tanks, albeit manned by 2nd Royal Tank Regiment. However, their first action saw the virtual destruction of one of their remaining light tank squadrons. The light tanks had been directed against Italian positions near the coast following the battle off Sidi Barrani. A squadron dashed forward in line ahead and swung into linea abreast to attack the Italian position. Unfortunately, between them and the Italian defenses lay an area of salt marsh, just to the west of Buk. One after another, the light tanks bogged down in the marsh, to be destroyed by the Italian guns. All told, the regiment lost 13 tanks, the best part of a squadron, and the matter was not finally settled until the cruiser tank squadron moved in and wiped out the guns. But by then it was too late for a squadron. Probably because there were so many of them, as much as for any other reason. Light tanks Mark V turned up all over the place, although they were of palpably little use. Indeed, one even accompanied B Squadron, 4th Royal Tank Regiment, to Eritrea at the start of 1941. This squadron, otherwise equipped with 16 A-12 Matilda tanks, was sent there to bolster an Indian infantry force that was attempting to defeat the Italian garrison. For the tanks it was as much a struggle against poor roads and rugged countryside as against 43 the Italians. And although they were in action on a number of occasions, they spent a lot of their time moving from place to place with great difficulty along mountain tracks that severely tested the transmission of the infantry tanks. For some reason they received 16 tons of spares for their one light tank and none at all for the Matildas, which they had to keep going by cannibalization. Winston Churchill's old regiment, the 4th Hussars, was sent to Greece as part of 1st Light Armored Brigade Group. It was equipped exclusively with light tanks Mark V, while the other armored regiment in the Brigade Group, the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, was armed with cruisers. When the German attack began early in the morning of the 6th of April 1941, the armor was out in front, ready to receive them. But it soon became clear that the light tanks, armed only with machine guns, could not destroy German armor. They could delay them for a while by judicious use of ground, but not hold them up forever. That required tanks or anti-tank guns, in both cases that were hitting to PDR weapon. To begin with, the Germans could not tell whether it was light tanks, cruiser tanks or anti-tank guns that were firing, and treated all three with equal respect. However, once they had sorted out the sheep from the goats, as it were, and appreciated that the light tanks were virtually no threat to their armor, they dealt with them accordingly. In the end, however, it was the long and continual retreat with no time to halt for maintenance, over rough roads and tricky mountain passes, that wore out tanks. By the time the 4th Hussars had crossed the Corinth Canal and proceeded by a roundabout route through the Peloponnese to the proposed embarkation port at Kalamata, they were reduced to just 10 tanks, which were soon bombed out of existence, leaving the survivors to fight on foot. By the end of April it was virtually all over. The number of crews got away, but tanks, by now all wrecks, had to be left behind. A short while later, on the 11th of May 1941, C Squadron, the 3rd Hussars, with 16 light tanks Mark V, was sent to bolster the defenses of Crete. It was another forlorn hope for the 3rd Hussars, who were obliged to destroy all their surviving tanks by the end of the month, while the survivors escaped from the island as best they could. 9 A-12 Matilda tanks of 7th RT were also sent to Crete, but in the long run had little to show for their efforts and also had to be abandoned. Malta, on the other hand, was a relatively peaceful location, if you overlook their raids. At least there was no fighting on the ground. A variety of tanks were posted there at different times, including some light tanks Mark V and VIC, mostly operated by a troop from the Royal Tank Regiment that seems to have been known by a variety of titles. The most distinctive thing about the tanks on Malta was their camouflagation. It appears to have been a sort of crazy paving pattern of brown lines painted over typical desert stone, intended to disguise the tanks against the background of dry stone walls that were a feature of the island. Further east, A few light tanks were stationed for a time on the island of Cyprus. The force, which was equipped with light tanks marked universal carriers and 1,500-weight trucks carrying TPD or anti-tank guns, was provided by the 7th Australian Divisional Cavalry Regiment, which had the difficult task, pending an expected German landing, of trying to simulate a much larger force by patrolling all over the island with crews wearing different hats. It was there from May until August 1941, after which threat of invasion diminished. It was then transferred to Syria. Here it largely replaced the 6th Australian Divisional Cavalry Regiment, and encountered the 9th Australian Divisional Cavalry Regiment, similarly equipped with light tanks Mark -1 tanks and universal carriers, which had seen action against Vichy French forces equipped with Renault R35 tanks. Although relatively small, these were much better armed and armored than the British light tanks, and in tank versus tank terms there was no contest. Even so, the Australians, by clever use of their equipment, ultimately managed to defeat the French forces and capture 2 of the Renault tanks in process, which they proceeded to use against their former owners. It seems that the 3rd Hussars were destined to be tied to their light tanks for years, and to be sent on some virtually suicidal missions with them. Following their attempted intervention in Norway in 1940 and their equally brave but ultimately pointless excursion to Crete in 1942, they were now destined to become involved in an even more fruitless attempt to salva Singapore in 1942. This time it was B Squadron, commanded by Major William Powlett, which sailed from Egypt in January 1942. In fact, they had reached Sumatra only 2 days before Singapore surrendered, and by the time they had unloaded their tanks and prepared them for action, they were ordered to sail with them again for WWII. This voyage was an epic in itself, since most of the tanks were loaded aboard a Dutch steamship while the balance of 8 tanks had to be loaded onto a lighter and towed to WWII. Even so, they got there and unloaded their tanks at Batavia, where they undertook some tank training in the unfamiliar surroundings of Junglean paddy fields. Following the disastrous Battle of the Java Sea, Japanese forces invaded Thailand, and B Squadron, the 3rd Hussars, was incorporated into Black Force, commanded by the Australian Brigadier Blackburn VC, and stationed at Buitenzorg. Black Force, which included American artillerymen and Australian infantry, saw some action against the Japanese, but they later learned that the Dutch authorities had decided to surrender and thus ultimately, in obedience to orders, were obliged to deny their tanks to the invaders by pushing them off a mountain road into a deep ravine with a fast-flowing torrent at the bottom. None of the men escaped. All became prisoners of the Japanese. It was the end of fruitless adventures as far as the rest of the regiment was concerned.